lots of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it's impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this. How often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us, on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? I don't know. But next time you see a man with a hairy face, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand. But in truth, he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit. And now, at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly, nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough, and there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you'll notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it's impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs.
I just ate a nice bowl of steak.
Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to their hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, you would see tiny little specks of dried-up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, and spinach, and fish fingers, and minced chicken livers, and all the other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat. If you look closer still, if you peered deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never went really hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on.
Always a bit of my armpit.
What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man.
Oh, I stink.
He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that, at any rate, would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She'd had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twits' face. In her right hand, she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye.
Where's my eye?
Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning, she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking.
Where's my beer?
Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers.
You're plotting something, Mr. Twit. Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something. You better be careful, because when I see you starting to plot, I'll watch you like a wombat.
Oh, do shut up, you old hag.
Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug.
I told you I was watching you. I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful.
To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet.
What's the matter with you?
Help! There's something in my bed!
Oh, but it's that giant skilly wiggler I saw on the floor just now. I tried to kill it, but it got away. It's got teeth like screwdrivers.
Help! Save me! It's all over my feet!
It'll bite off your toes.
Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water.
Here you are, then.
He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night.
By golly, it is a giant skilly wiggler. It'll bite off your nose.
Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese.
Hey, my spaghetti's moving.
It's a new kind. It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot.
Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin.
It's not as good as the ordinary kind. It's too squishy.
I find it very tasty. Very.
I find it rather bitter. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time.
You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?
Why?
And why it had a nasty, bitter taste?
Why?
Because it was worms.
Huh?
Because it was worms!
To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his workshed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night, he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder.
Woman! That stick's too long for you.
Why, so it is. I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was.
There's something wrong, all right.
What could have happened? It must suddenly have grown longer.
Don't be a fool. How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow.
Then what on earth has happened?
It's not the stick, it's you. It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now.
That's not true.
You're shrinking, woman.
It's not possible.
Oh, yes, it jolly well is. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days.
Never.
Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got.
No.
You've got the dreaded shrinks.
I feel all trembly. I've got to sit down.
There you are. Look at you. You're sitting in your old chair and you shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground. They're dangling in there.
Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair.
You've got the shrinks. You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen. I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks.
What happens?
Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes.
I can't bear it.
It's a terrible disease. The worst in the world.
How long have I got? Before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?
At the rate you're going, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days.
But isn't there anything we could do?
There's only one cure for the shrinks.
Oh, tell me.
We'll have to hurry.
I'm ready. I'll do anything you say.
You won't last long if you don't.
What is it I must do?
You You've got to be stretched.
Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching.
There. I've got 100 balloons, lots of string, a cylinder of gas for filling the balloons, and this iron ring fixed into the ground. Stand here, Mrs. Twit.
He tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. Then he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied round her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head.
Can you feel them stretching you?
I can! They're stretching me like mad!
Just 10 more balloons to tie on.
Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner.
There. Goodbye, my dear. I'll just leave her like that for a couple of days and nights. Teach her a lesson.
He was just about to leave her when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something very silly.
Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me. There's enough pull here to take me to the moon.
To take you to the moon. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh, dear me, no.
Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe.
Very well, my angel.
And with a ghoulish grin on his lips, Mr. Twit knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring.
Oi!
She went up like a rocket.
Help! Save me!
But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, Mrs. Twit was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast.
What a pretty sight. How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever.
Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea.
If I can get rid of some of these balloons, I will stop going up and start to come down.
She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down.
There! I've bitten through 20 strings. I've stopped going up. I'm just staying still. Now, if I bite through one more string...
She did. And very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all. And because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out.
Here I come, you grisly old runion! You rotten old turd! You filthy old rabbit! I'll get you for this! I'll swish you to a swaddle! I'll swash you to a swizzle! I'll lash you to a nozzle! I'll lash you to a nozzle! Got you! Take that! And that! And this! And the other! Take that!
But that's enough of that. We really can't can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. Let me describe Mr. and Mrs. Twits' house. Well, it's not exactly a house, more like a prison. There's not a window in it anywhere.
Who wants windows?
Mr. Twits said when they were building it.
Who wants every Tom, Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing?
It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. As for the garden, it was ghastly. Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles,
They keep out nasty nosy little children.
she used to say. Near the house is Mr. Twit's work shed, and to one side there is the big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. Not far from the tree is the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit.
Hello.
You will hear more about them later. Once a week, on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds, and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before Bird Pie Day, he would put the ladder up against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hugtite, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, the birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible Hugtite. The moment they landed on a branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was Bird Pie Day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were. Song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, little Jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. Now for the monkeys. The 4 monkeys in the cage in the garden were all one family. They were Mugglewump and his wife and their 2 small children. In the old days, Mr. and Mrs. Twit had worked in a circus as monkey trainers. They used to teach monkeys to do tricks and to dress up in human clothes and to smoke pipes and all the rest of that nonsense. Today, although they were retired, Mr. Twit still wanted to train monkeys. It was his dream that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world. That meant that the monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down. They had to balance one on top of the other upside down. They even had to eat and drink upside down. And that is not an easy thing to do. In fact, it's almost impossible. But the monkeys simply had to do it, otherwise they got nothing. The monkeys absolutely hated having to do this upside-down nonsense day after day. It made them giddy standing on their heads for hours on end. But Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept them practicing for 6 hours every day, and if they didn't do as they were told, Mrs. Twit would soon come running with her beastly stick. Mugglewump and his family longed to escape from the cage and go back to the African jungle where they came from. They hated Mr. and Mrs. Twit for making their lives so miserable. They also hated them for what they did to the birds every Tuesday and Wednesday. They used to jump about in the cage, waving their arms and shouting,
Fly away, birds!
But these were English birds, and they couldn't understand the weird African language the monkeys spoke.
Don't sit on that big dead tree.
What are they trying to say, the poor dear?
Just been smeared all over with sticky glue.
Why can't they speak our language?
Go and sit somewhere else.
So the birds went on using the big dead tree and getting caught.
Oh.
Then, one day, a truly magnificent bird flew down out of the sky and landed on the monkey cage.
language. What on earth are you doing over here in England, roly-poly bird?
Like the monkeys, the roly-poly bird came from Africa and spoke the same language as they did.
I've come for a holiday. I like to travel. For most people, flying away on holiday is very expensive, but I can fly anywhere in the world for nothing.
Do you know how to talk to these English birds?
Of course I do. It's no good going to a country and not knowing the language.
Then we must hurry. Today is Tuesday, and over there you can already see the revolting Mr. Twit up the ladder painting sticky glue on all the branches of the big dead tree. This evening, when the birds come in to roost, you must warn them not to perch on that tree, or they will be made into bird pie.
So that evening, the roly-poly bird flew round and round the big dead tree, singing out,
There's sticky stuff all over the tree. If you land in the branches, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie.
The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket to snatch all the birds from the big dead tree, there wasn't a single one on it. They were all sitting on top of the monkey cage. Mr. Twit wasn't going to wait another week for his bird pie supper. He loved bird pie. It was his favourite meal. So that very same day, he smeared all the top bars of the monkey cage with sticky glue, as well as the branches of the big dead tree.
Now I'll get you whichever one you sit on.
The monkeys crouched inside the cage watching. Later on, the roly-poly bird came swooping in for an evening chat.
Don't land in our cage, roly-poly bird. Covered in sticky glue. So is the tree.
That evening, as the sun went down and all the birds came in again to roost, the roly-poly bird flew round and round to warn them.
There's sticky stuff now on the cage and the tree. If you land on either, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie.
The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket, not a single bird was sitting on either the monkey cage or the big dead tree. They were all perched happily on the roof of Mr. Twit's house.
I'll wipe that silly laugh off your beaks. I'll get you next time, you filthy, feathery frumps. I'll wring your necks, the whole lot of you, and have you bubbling in the pot for bird pie before this day is out.
How are you going to do that? I won't have you smearing sticky glue all over the roof of our house.
I've got a great idea. We'll both go into town right away and we'll buy a gun each. How's that, eh?
Brilliant! We'll buy those big shotguns that spray out 50 bullets or more with each bag.
Exactly. Lock up the house while I go and make sure the monkeys are safely shut away.
Right.
Attention! Upside down, all of you, and jump to it. One on top of the other. Quick, or you'll feel Mrs. Twit's stick across your backsides. That's right. Now, stay there till we come back, and don't you dare move or overbalance. Understand? Come on, Mrs. Twit.
As soon as Mr. and Mrs. Twit had disappeared down the road, the monkeys all flipped back onto their feet the right way up.
Quick, roly-poly bird, get the key.
What key?
The key to the door of our cage. It's hanging on a nail in the work shed.
The roly-poly bird flew down and came back with the key in its beak. Mugglewump took it, put it in the lock, and turned it. The door opened.
We're free! We're free! Hooray! Where shall we go, Dad? Where shall we hide?
Calm down, everybody. Before we escape from this beastly place, we have one important thing to do.
What?
We're going to turn those terrible twits upside down.
What? You must be joking, Dad. How can we possibly do that?
We can. We are going to make them stand on their heads for hours and hours.
Oh.
Perhaps forever. Follow me, my friends. Follow me.
He scampered off towards the house, and the others went after him.
Buckets and paintbrushes. That's what we want next. There are plenty in the work shed. Hurry up, everyone.
Inside the work shed, there was an enormous barrel of hug-tight sticky glue, the stuff he used for catching birds.
Fill your buckets. We're now going into the big house. I know where the key is. I saw that maggoty Mrs. Twit hide it under the mat.
Into the house they went, all 4 monkeys with their buckets of sticky glue. Then came the roly-poly bird flying in after them with a bucket in his beak and a brush in his claw.
This is the grand and glorious living room where those 2 fearful, frumptious freaks eat bird pie every week for supper.
Oh, please, don't mention bird pie again. It gives me the shudders.
We mustn't waste time. I want everyone to paint sticky glue all over the ceiling.
Oh?
Cover it all. Smear it in every corner.
Over the ceiling? Why the ceiling?
Never mind why. Just do as you're told.
But how do we get up there?
Monkeys can reach anywhere. Come on, jump on the table. Stand in the chairs. Hop on each other's shoulders. Hurry up. Those terrible twits will be back any moment. And this time, they'll have guns. Get on with it, for heaven's sake.
And so the great blue painting of the ceiling began. All the other birds who had been sitting on the roof flew in to help, carrying paintbrushes in their claws and beaks. There were buzzards, magpies, rooks, ravens, and many more. And with so many helpers, the job was soon finished.
What now, Dad?
Now for the greatest upside-down trick of all time. Are you ready?
We're ready. We're ready.
Pull this huge carpet out from under the furniture and stick it onto the ceiling.
Onto the ceiling? But that's impossible, Dad.
I'll stick you onto the ceiling if you don't shut up.
He's balmy. He's batty. He's nutty. He's screwy.
He's wacky. Poor old Muggles has gone off his wump at last.
Oh, rubbish. All you nitwits, hold!
The carpet was enormous. It had a red and gold pattern on it. It covered the entire floor from wall to wall. It's not easy to pull an enormous carpet off the floor when the room is full of tables and chairs. But with the monkeys and the birds all pulling and puffing, it was dragged off the floor and finally hoisted up onto the ceiling. And there it stuck. All at once, the whole ceiling of the living room was carpeted in red and gold.
Now the big table. Turn it upside down and put a dollop of sticky glue onto the bottom of each leg. We shall stick that onto the ceiling as well. Hurry! Good. You've done it.
Will it stay there? Is the glue strong enough?
It's the strongest glue in the world. It's the special bird-catching, bird-killing glue for smearing on trees.
Please, I have asked you before not to mention that subject.
I do beg your pardon. I'm so excited I hardly know what I'm saying. Now, the chairs. All the chairs must be stuck upside down to the ceiling. And in their right places. Oh, do hurry up, everybody. Any moment now, those 2 filthy freaks are going to come rushing in with their guns. Oh, good. And now the smaller tables and the big sofa. Up it goes. And the sideboard. And the lamps. The ashtrays. And that beastly plastic gnome on the sideboard. Everything, absolutely everything must be stuck to the ceiling.
What now?
The pictures on the wall. Turn them all upside down. And will one of you birds please fly out and watch to see when those frumptious freaks are coming back?
I'll go. I'll sit on the telephone wires and keep guard. It'll give me a rest.
We're finished. It's perfect.
Well done, everybody.
They're coming back. They're coming back.
Quickly, the birds flew back onto the roof of the house. The monkeys rushed into their cage and stood upside down, one on top of the other. Shh!
I'm glad to see those monkeys are still upside down.
They're too stupid to do anything else. Hey, look at all those cheeky birds still up on the roof. Let's go inside and load our lovely new guns, and then it'll be bang, 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 bird pie for supper.
Just as Mr. and Mrs. Twit were about to enter the house, 2 black ravens swooped low over their heads. Each bird carried a paintbrush in its claw, and each paintbrush was smeared with sticky glue. Very likely, they brushed a streak of sticky glue onto the top of Mr. and Mrs. Twits' heads.
What was that? Some beastly bird has dropped his dirty droppings on my head.
On mine too, I felt it.
Oh, and don't touch it. You'll get it all over your hands. Come inside and we'll wash it off.
The filthy, dirty brutes. I bet they did it on purpose. Just wait till I've loaded up my gun.
And into the house they went.
What's this?
What's happened in here?
They stood in the middle of the room looking up. All the furniture, the big table, the sofa, the lamps, the carpet, everything was stuck upside down to the ceiling. And the floor they were standing on was absolutely bare. What's more, it had been painted white to look like the ceiling.
Look, the floor's up there. We are standing on the ceiling.
We're upside down. We must be. We're standing on the ceiling, looking down at the floor.
Oh, help! Help! I'm beginning to feel giddy.
So am I. I don't like this one little bit.
We're upside down and all the blood's going to my head.
Oh, no.
If we don't do something quickly, I shall die. I know I will.
I've got it. I know what we'll do. We'll stand on our heads. Then we'll be the right way up.
So they stood on their heads. And of course, the moment the tops of their heads touched the floor, the sticky glue that the ravens had brushed on a few moments before did its job.
I'm stuck.
We're fixed to the floorboards.
Through a crack in the door, the monkeys watched. They jumped right out of their cage the moment the Twits had gone inside. And the roly-poly bird watched. And all the other birds flew in and out to catch a glimpse of this extraordinary sight. That evening, Mugglewump and his family went up to the big wood on top of the hill. And in the tallest tree of all, they built a marvellous treehouse. All the birds, especially the big ones, made their nests around the treehouse so that nobody could see it from the ground.
You monkeys can't stay up here forever, you know.
Why not? It's a lovely place.
Just you wait till the winter comes. Monkeys don't like cold weather, do they?
They most certainly don't. Oh, the winter's so very cold over here.
It's all snow and ice. Sometimes it's so cold, a bird will wake up in the morning with his feet frozen to the bough that he's been roosting on.
Then what shall we do? My family will all be deep freezed.
No, they won't. When the first leaves start falling from the trees in the autumn, you can all fly home to Africa with me.
Don't be ridiculous. Monkeys can't fly.
You can sit on my back. I shall take you one at a time. You will travel by the roly-poly superjet, and it won't cost you a penny.
In the horrid house, Mr. and Mrs. Twit were still stuck upside down to the floor of the living room.
It's all your fault, you ugly old cow. You're the one who went hopping around shouting, "We're upside down! We're upside down!"
And you're the one who said to stand on our heads so we'd be the right way up, you whiskery old warthog. Now we're stuck here forever.
You may be stuck, but not me. I'm gonna get away.
Mr. Twit wriggled and squirmed, and he squiggled and wormed, but the sticky glue held him to the floor just as tightly as it had once held the poor birds in the big dead tree. He was still as upside down as ever, standing on his head. But heads are not made to be stood upon. If you stand on your head for a very long time, a horrid thing happens. With so much weight on it from up above, Mr. Twit's head began to get squashed into his body. Soon, it had disappeared completely, sunk out of sight in the fatty folds of his flabby neck.
I'm shrinking.
So am I.
Help me! Call a doctor! I'm getting the dreaded shrink.
This time, it wasn't a fake. Mr. and Mrs. Twit really did have the shrinks. Their heads shrank into their necks. Then their necks began shrinking into their bodies. And their bodies began shrinking into their legs. And their legs began shrinking into their feet. And 1 week later, on a nice sunny afternoon, a man called Fred came round to read the gas meter. When nobody answered the door, Fred peeped into the house, and there he saw on the floor of the living room 2 bundles of old clothes, 2 pairs of shoes, and a walking stick. There was nothing more left in this world of Mr. and Mrs. Twit. And everyone, including Fred, shouted, "Hooray!"